lady is the grand dame of Molinology in Europe. In 2005, she was part of organizing a European Union-wide study of the tide mills of Western Europe. Look that up on the internet, tide mills of Western Europe. You'll be amazed at what she pulled up. The first time I met her was in 2007 when we brought her to Dorchester for an early conference and she talked about Portuguese tide mills. In 2009, my wife and I did a tour in Spain and Portugal. We had a day off and I got invited to speak at her conference at her museum. And she spent an entire day running me around some of the 30 tide mills in the basin across the river from Lisbon, Portugal. In 2017, I met her at an ocean energy conference in France. And here it is, 2021. She is an amazing person. She is sharp. She is good. Please welcome Cláudia Silveira.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a pleasure for me to participate and to contribute to this conference. Well, I would also to congratulate the Tide Mill Institute for organizing this event, and each year you keep connecting researchers around the world and the audiences interested in this topic of tide mills. I will present an overview about Portuguese tide mills. And of course, it's one of the countries in Europe that knew this technology. All over Europe, we assist for the early Middle Ages to the build of this kind of mill. And I would like to stress the fact that although this technology was already in use by Europe of that time and also in some of the Portuguese shores, as you can see in this chronology where we can find references to tide mills in Portugal since the beginning of the 13th century. The first of all near Lisbon at Tujal, and we keep seeing the build of new tide mills around the Portuguese shores. I would like to stress the fact that although this technology was already in use from the 13th century onwards in Portugal, it was during the 15th and 16th centuries that an incredible number of tide mills was built, especially in the most important maritime ports. I believe that this impressive diffusion of this technology must be related with the beginning of the Portuguese expansion and the discoveries, which is marked by the conquest of the city of Ceuta in North Africa by the Portuguese King John I in 1415. This conquest was part of a project both religious and political, which took the Crusades from the Iberian Peninsula to North Africa. The most important, because I don't have time to explain all this context of the beginning of the Portuguese expansion, and that this is not the topic that I will present you. But the most important is to say that the conquest of Ceuta was the beginning of the construction by the Portuguese monarchy of a vast network of territories in result of military conquests and of maritime expeditions that led to the profound transformation in a global scale. All this process implied the establishment of an important administrative and economic infrastructure in the Portuguese territories, both in Portugal and in other parts of the Portuguese Empire. Therefore, tide mills are present along the entire Portuguese coast, from Viana do Castelo at the north of the country here, to Aveiro, a little bit south, Figueira da Foz, as you can see here, the location, Salir do Porto, and of course, however, is in the south of the country, since Lisbon and all the southern territory, that we can find the biggest concentrations due either to the configuration of the coast, different from that of the north of the country, and in special due to the most important demographic and economic and also commercial development of the southern maritime towns and their connection with the maritime expeditions that took place from the 15th century onwards. The biggest concentrations can be found, therefore, in the Tagus estuary. You can find here around the city of Lisbon, with 45 tide mills identified up to now, which is one of the biggest concentrations in a world scale. But also in the south shores of Algarve, we find a strong concentration, as you can find here, around Ria Formosa and the Guadiana estuary. And also we can find in the Sado and Mira estuary a lot of tide mills. Being all of these places important maritime portuary areas and very important ports for the organization of the military and maritime expeditions of the Portuguese kings. I can present you some of these tide mills from north to south, some of them still in place and adapted to other uses nowadays. Other disappeared but survived in archival and archival research and in ancient cartography or represented in old photos, like the case of this first one, de Asanhas do Dom Prior, the tide mill of Viana do Castelo, in an old photo. But this tide mill still remains and has been transformed and adapted to become nowadays an interpretation center and environmental education center. In the north, this mill of Viana do Castelo in the Lima estuary is mentioned by the first time in 1417. Besides the grading of grain, it operated also a sawmill. And I must say that this is the only sawmill that I know in all Iberian Peninsula, which was operated by tides. More to south, to Aveiro, we find another tide mill with 10 pairs of millstones, which is built in the beginning of the 15th century. And it's still present in the center of this city of Aveiro, in the main channel, and today is a municipal building used for the city municipal representatives meetings and as an exhibition center. On Tagus estuary, we find the height of the tides varies from 1 to 4 meters, and we find here the most ancient examples of Portuguese tide mills in the 13th and 14th and the beginning of the 15th century. However, most of these tide mills that we find in Tagus estuary, the majority of them was built between 1475 and 1525. The political, economic, and social dynamics around the port of Lisbon during the 15th and 16th centuries was closely associated with a growing demand of bread and of sea biscuit or art-track biscuit for the merchant ships and for Royal Navy. So there was a growing demand of energy to which tide mills with their important production capacity responded, guaranteeing the supplies to Lisbon and to the ships that left its port for overseas expeditions. These mills were located mainly on the south bank of Tagus River, as you can see here, where we find one different configuration of the shores, more appropriated to this important implantation, and where we can find also the most important factory connected with the production of art-track biscuit, the royal establishments of Val de Zebre. This was a vast complex dedicated to this activity and functioned since the 15th century at least, and was under royal administration. And here, as you can see, it's a huge building associated also with a tide mill. And we can find here these circles represent the ovens of to cook the biscuit. And in the 18th century, when this building was described, we find here 27 ovens to produce this biscuit. So this place needed not only the production of this meal associated, but all the tide mills around this place were producing for the activity of this factory. So the proximity with this complex explains the investment in the construction of tide mills by some of the most important members of nobility and the royal administration, many of them responsible for running the administrative structures that controlled the commercial connections of the Portuguese Empire or the administration of some of the territories under Portuguese control, such as some viceroyals of the Portuguese Indies or the Atlantic Islands, but also some merchants, important merchants connected with international trade. A comparison can be made with the Roman mills complex of Barbegal, near Arles in France, where a huge number of mills was built in order to produce the flour for feeding Roman expeditions based in the port of Arles. Some of examples of these mills can be found in old cartography, such as the tide mill of Alcântara near Lisbon, that is represented here we can see the mill pond and the tide mill in this place. This mill is mentioned, it's one of the oldest ones, mentioned in the beginning of the 14th century, and disappeared after the earthquake and the tsunami of the 18th century, which destroyed the city of Lisbon. We can find also other cartography representing this mill, as you can see here. There was a river that was also feeding the mill pond as well as the seawater. And it's also represented in this tile in this spot here. And nowadays, as you can see, we find the place where the mill was built is a very industrialized area, very close to, nowadays is in the city of Lisbon, but it's a very industrialized area where all the remainings of this mill have disappeared. But in the Tagus estuary, we can still find some examples of this kind of building, which had horizontal wheels, mainly most of them between 5 and 8 pairs of millstones. This one is the largest of the Tagus estuary with 10 pairs of millstones. And in some of them, we still find the insignias of this military order that was controlling this territory where these tide mills were built. In the Sado estuary, we find also some examples of this technology. We find here the city and the port of Setúbal with a large estuary. And here we find one of these mills, the mill of Troia, which is also represented in this old drawing of the city of Setúbal, and we can find the mill here. And in this estuary, we have also this mill of Pinheiro represented here with this large mill pond in an area that was very dynamic in a commercial point of view, especially connected with the salt production and salt trade. Here we find the Morisca tide mill that is one of the mills that Bud was visiting when he came to Portugal some years ago. And this one in a kind of very different condition, also in the Sado estuary. More to south, we find other mills, but very little ones, because it's not so so dynamic area. So the mill adapts to this, and they don't need a large facility like the mills in Tagus estuary or in the ports of Algarve, as we will see. In Algarve, we find also mills in several locations, since the estuary of Guadiana, it's one of the oldest places where tide mills are also mentioned in Portugal. In this old drawing of the 16th century, we find here a tide mill represented in Castro Marim, near the shore, and this mill is documented for the first time still in the 13th century. And after that, several other mills were built around this area, and some of them in this moment have collapsed, and others have just disappeared, and we only have the documentation and old cartography to comprovate the existence of these buildings. In Tavira, also in Algarve, we find other representations of these mills, like this one with the mill pond, and very interesting, between Tavira and Faro in Algarve, we find also a huge concentration of this kind of mills, around 50 of them. And some of these mills were after adapted and integrated salt pans. As you can see here, this is a representation of a salt pan by the middle of the 20th century. And the mill pond of the mill was transformed in the reservoir of the salt water that feed the salt pan. Here we have also Rio Formosa, the location of several tide mills around Faro and Olhão. Such of these ones no longer existing, but we can see them in some old photos. This one remains, and the interior of this mill is in a relatively good condition. And in the Rat River, also in Algarve, other representations of these mills can be seen here, and some of them still remain and still are marking and characterizing this landscape of these Algarve villages. As you can see here, although the earliest mentions of tide mills in Algarve go back to the second half of the 13th century, the majority of these mills was built, like in Tagus estuary, between 1450 and 1550. And if you compare both of the chronologies of these both sides, we can see that it was during the 15th and 16th centuries that these mills were built in a large scale. And this corresponds to the moment when port towns of Algarve, like the Tagus estuary, were the main suppliers of flour and hard-tack biscuits for the conquered towns of North Africa, which provided a strong impetus to build these mills. Among the promoters of this construction of tide mills in the south of the country, we find here again men linked with nobility and to the service to the king. And even we find here even privateers in royal service who owned ships and organized expeditions to safeguard the security of Portuguese shores and ships, and had to feed their tripulations. So we find all these mills that in Portugal are especially of the Rodizio type or the Regolf type, this one especially in Algarve. The study of Portuguese tide mills is therefore essential to understand the complex organization of the military, scientific, administrative, and commercial excursions of the Portuguese Empire from the 15th to the 18th centuries, which had Lisbon as a central piece of all the articulation of territories at a global scale. And I thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm available to answer all the questions you might have. Thank you.
But I have a question.
Question.
Claudia, do you know of any tide mills in the Azores or the Cape Verde Islands?
No, in fact, no. I believe that the conditions that we find there would not be appropriate for that. But, well, in this subject, in this topic of tide mills, I had already some surprises. So we can say that no mill has never been tried to be built there. We know that this technology was brought after to Brazil and to the estuary of Amazonas, where it was adapted to the sugar processing. But in Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde, or other parts of the Portuguese Empire, we don't have any reference by now to this kind of mill. In Madeira, for instance, such as this island had a lot of freshwater courses. A lot of mills were built, but river mills, not tidal.
Okay. One of the things that's really interesting is that the miller that was the miller in the tide mill I just talked about was originally from Portugal.
Oh, yes.
He came over as a young man, very young, maybe a teenager, but it's interesting that he was from Portugal.
Yes, and it was interesting to know what place exactly in Portugal, because he could have already contact with this tide mill technology if he was from one of these spots in the Portuguese shore.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to know the origin of this miller. If you know that, I would like to hear about it.
Yeah, I wish I did. At this point, I only know that he was from Portugal. Maybe we can be in touch offline.
Thank you.
Okay.
Many people did come from Portugal to Massachusetts. New Bedford as a whaling port and then as a fishing port had many Portuguese individuals. So that was part of that, probably part of that movement of people. Thank you, Claudia. I look forward to meeting you again somewhere in the tide mill world.
Thank you.